So, welcome to this course on managing change in organization, and we are running into the 5th week of this course, and in this lecture we are going to talk about power and politics of the change. Now, the moment we talk about power and politics, basically this is related to what happens to the employees the moment they decide about the change and the kind of change that is being initiated by the management and how it is going to impact them in terms of their status, position and power. So, it is related to all the stakeholders, because the kind of dynamics that happens among all the stakeholders, whether it is employees, whether it is managers, whether it is workers, they start thinking about that what will happen in the change scenario, right. And the moment they think about the change scenario, and the power base of the employees also gets changed. For example, when you are going for restructuring an organization, the moment you think about restructuring an organization, you know that you have decided to bring about a change in the number of levels in the employees or in the hierarchy. So, the moment you decide to bring about a change in the number of levels in the hierarchy, those managers whose position and power is going to be upsetted, definitely they will not be happy. They would like to retain their power, their status and their position in the organization, and they are not sure that how it is going to affect them in the change scenario. So, what we are going to discuss in this lecture is that how people react to the change and what kind of behavior they adopt during the change, and this behavior could be termed as political behavior, because most of the time they would be interested to safeguard their interests, right. So, the one important thing that happens, that when you are going to initiate any kind of change, that individuals and groups, they think that their position, their power is going to be upset. It means there is going to be change in the power dynamics of the employees in the organization, right. So, the moment they think about that, yes, the power dynamics of the employees in the organization is going to change, they start thinking about it and they also start reacting about it. Then how they do react? Okay. See, some of the employees, what they do? They would like to maintain the status quo, they would not like to go for any kind of change. So, they start reacting, they would go against the change and they would do all kind of things including their behavior, so that the status quo is maintained and the management is not in a position to bring about any kind of change, right. While some managers would also perceive it as an opportunity to improve their position. For say the same example, if you take, when we say that you are going for structural changes. So, this structural changes is going to reduce the number of levels in the hierarchy. So, suppose you have 7 levels in the hierarchy earlier, say E 1 to E 7, now you want to bring it to 4, say E 1 to E 4. Now, suppose you say that E 1 and E 2 is going to be E 1, E 3 and E 4 is going to be E 2, E 5, 6 is going to be E 3 and E 7 is going to be the top one. So, now the moment you decide that these 7 levels would be converted into 4 levels, definitely those who are going to work at E 1, E 3, E 5, their position is going to change. So, these managers would like to defend the status quo, because they have been enjoying this power in the hierarchy so far. So, some managers would like to defend on that, because the changes. Similarly, some of them who are on the lower level, and if their position is getting improved, then they would see it as an opportunity to grow up in the organization. So, they would think that they would be receiving more power, right. So, it is not that everybody is going to react negatively, some of them are also going to react positively, because they are going to be benefited out of it, right. So, the change managers must be aware about these kind of political dynamics, that how employees are reacting, whether they are looking it as an opportunity to grow and develop themselves in terms of their status, power and position, or some of the managers who might be interested to defend their status quo and they would like to maintain the same position, right. So, what we are going to discuss further is that how these kind of issues need to be addressed and resolved by the change managers. Now, we need to consider a organization's a field where these kind of politics are going to happen, right. So, what is the role of the leaders? So, leaders need to understand and manage the politics of the organizational change, because they are ultimately responsible to bring and implement successful change. So, unless they would be able to understand these kind of politics and address and resolve those issues, related to the behavior of the employees, so that they do not get manipulated, then it is not going to be in the interest of the organization, right. So, organizations could be considered as a field where this kind of political behavior would be reflected by the individuals, whether it is individuals or group. So, the individuals and groups who are going to be affected by this kind of change, right, they would like to protect it, they would like to defend it, they would like to influence these kind of decisions, so that it does not happen. And most of these protection say influence happens because you as an individual or a group in an organization would like to see your interest at the top compared to the organizational interest, because any kind of change management initiative is kept in mind what the organizational interest, but if you are looking at your self interest, your narrow interest, probably that is where the conflict happens between the interest of the organization and your own interest. So, if your interest gets affected in the process of the change, then you engage in some kind of political behavior, and if your interest is not going to be affected and you consider it as an opportunity for growth and development of you as individual, then you do not defend it, you support it, right. So, there could be a conflict of interest between you and the organization, right. So, if you are powerful, then you would not like it to happen, and if you are not that powerful, then you keep quiet or you support the decision, provided you think that there are certain benefits to you. So, it is very much important to understand the kind of interest, conflict of interest that is going to be there, right, because the power that people and groups enjoy, right, it is going to determine the outcome of the decision process, decisions related to what? The change, right. So, you do not go by logic and rational argument that yes, this is in the interest of the organization, it would be benefiting to the organization, and that is how organization is going to grow and develop itself, right. So, on the one side you have the growth and development of the organization, the benefit related to the organization, and on the other side your own interest. So, if your interest dominates and you are so powerful, then you would not allow to let it happen. You would not allow such decisions to happen in the organization, and that is where this creates problem, right. And this kind of behavior becomes more intense when you think that these kind of changes are going to affect you more. It means, it is going to upset the existing balance of power in the organization. So, if your power base is disturbed, then you may not feel happy, and then you engage in such behaviors like manipulation, adjustments, reaction. So, these kind of behaviors could be considered as political behavior, because you are not favorable to the change, right. So, and so then what you do? You engage in the activities like telling that this change is not good, it is detrimental to the organization, whatever efforts that is being brought to initiate this change is not good, and that is how the resistance starts among the employees and managers, right. So, organizations are the fields where these kind of thing happens, and it all depends upon whether there is a conflict of interest between the individuals and the organizations, and how individuals perceive any kind of change in the organization, and then the kind of behavior that they show, which could be considered as political in nature. Moving further, if employees are engaged in these kind of behaviors, political behaviors, then what happens? What kind of implications it has for change managers, right. See, the role of the change manager is what? To successfully implement change in the organization. So, what they need to understand? They need to understand the power dynamics that goes on among the stakeholders. The stakeholders could be employees and others in the organization, suppliers, vendors, managers, right. Even part of the community and the society could be stakeholders, right. So, you have to see that how you are going to predispose, so that either people who are supporting it is good, or those who are resisting it, those how you are going to manage it. Now, if you look at this example, this clearly shows that people are going in different directions, right. So, if you look at these kind of people, right, they are resisting change, they are not supporting, and these kind of people, they are going to be happy, because they think that it is good for them, and that is why if you look at this shows different directions. If people are going in different directions, either supporting or resisting the change, then what needs to be done? So, what is the role of the change managers? They need to identify that they are the various stakeholders, how these stakeholders are going to experience or perceive change, and then how we are going to manage various stakeholders in the process, right. And that is why stakeholder management become very important. So, they do not engage in political behavior, and if they do not engage in political behavior, then there would be less resistance and more support to the change in the organization. Now, moving further, what we are going to talk about, the most important part is the power and authority, the power that is being enjoyed by the people in the organization, right. And what is going to be upsetted is the power base, right. So, it is because of the power. Power is the ability to influence or exert influence on that behavior. So, this kind of power that you have been enjoying, right, because being in a hierarchy is going to be changed, right. So, if you have got power, you have been delegated authority and you are in a position to decide certain things, and if that status is going to change, then you feel disturbed and you think that yes, you need to maintain your power and position, you need to maintain your authority of decision making, you do not want to delegate it further to anybody else, because you have been enjoying and exercising this kind of power to take decisions, right. So, that becomes really very disturbing. For example, if you look at this figure, the person who is in a powerful position would not like to get it disturbed, right. So, what I am trying to say here or connect here with the change is that yes, it is the power base of the individual which is very important, especially the legitimate power or the power that you have received in a hierarchical situation, a hierarchical organization, and because of which you have got an authority to take certain decisions, that should not be disturbed, right. So, the power and authority is very important, and then you have to see that who are more powerful in the hierarchy, right. For example, some of the stakeholders may be more powerful, some of them are not going to be powerful. So, those who are powerful stakeholders in the organization, and if they are not supporting or if they are trying to block a change, then the possibility of implementing a successful change gets negated, right. And if these powerful stakeholders, they are supporting, then it becomes easy for the change managers to carry out the change successfully, right. So, you have to see and identify those stakeholders who are powerful, because they need to manage better compared to other stakeholders who are not so powerful or who are not in a position to act either to support or block a change, right. So, it becomes very important for managers to identify those stakeholders who are in a powerful position first, and second, who can act either to support or block a change. So, what needs to be done here? For example, you know that these are the powerful stakeholders who can support, right. So, you need to garner their support very much, so that they help you, and suppose they are going to block, then you need to manage them, right. So, you need to manage them in such a way, so that there is a less resistance from them to oppose any kind of change in the organization. Then if you are not having a legitimate authority, then what you need to do? Then you are not in a position. So, what matters basically that what is your position in the hierarchy and whether you have got any legitimate authority to support or change, block the change, right. So, if you are not having, then there is no problem. So, especially in the hierarchy, the power rests with senior managers, functional managers, right. And if they are supporting, then it becomes very easy, and if they do not support, then this becomes a problem, right. So, what the leadership should do, that they should also give authority and power to the managers, especially change managers who are going to take up this job, and they should also be made responsible to manage any kind of effort from the powerful stakeholders to block a change, or if they are going to resist a change, and ensure that they are in a position to see that how these powerful forces could be neutralized, so that they could be able to garner some support for the change from these powerful block or what you call the stakeholders. So, moving further, what we are going to discuss is that how you are going to acquire, exercise this kind of power and influence, right. So, what you need to do? You need to promote their reputation for delivering successful change. So, the change managers must be given enough power and authority, so that they are able to take up the cause of the change, they are able to successfully deliver the change. And if you are not given them enough legitimate power, then other powerful stakeholders start raising doubts, start asking questions about their power, about their authority to initiate this kind of change, right. So, the first thing that the top management should do is that provide enough power and authority to the change managers, so that they can exercise them and influence powerful stakeholders to neutralize their efforts, especially related to when they want to block the change and when they want to create some kind of resistance to the change, right. So, what are the things that they need to do? First of all, you need to ensure that stakeholders are going to be dependent on these powerful managers who have initiated the change. So, you need to take certain steps to increase others' dependence on the change managers, right. So, it is possible only when you make them powerful and you have given them legitimate authority, right. It means they are in a position to decide about the resources. So, they become a party in allocating resources to you, right. So, they look at the resources and then they see that how much resources you should be given, right. They should be also be allowed to identify the importance of these resources before allocating and then decide how they are going to allocate resources, right. And they can also see that how these resources are going to be given to all the stakeholders. So, they need to ensure whether they will be able to get the resources that you provide or not. So, your job is not only to look at the resources that you are giving, but also that the extent to which they are important for the stakeholders, and also ensure that they are able to get these resources, so that they are going to support it, right. So, at the first stage what you need to do is increase dependence for the resources among the stakeholders, so that they come to you to get the resources, and if that happens, you will be able to address and manage these powerful stakeholders. Second thing is that those who are trying to influence, for them you need to minimize their dependence, right. So, on the one hand you need to ensure that you are going to increase the dependence for powerful stakeholders, but also decrease the stakeholder dependence for those who are not powerful, right. So, you look at that what are the different sources of supply, how are going to look at the resources, right, and then you are going to see that how you are going to allocate resources for them. So, both kind of activities are important, increasing dependence for some of the stakeholders and also decreasing dependence for some of the stakeholders. And third approach that is given here is developing a relationship which is based on collaboration, that is what we call building collaborative relationships. So, here what you need to do is that you have to identify how you can help to achieve the targets. You need to also communicate with others, especially those who can be trusted, so that you can encourage them to provide the resources that you require, and also enlist the help of others to influence the third party, which is not accessible to you. So, all these activities are related to collaboration, right. So, if you are able to collaborate through collaboration, communication and trust, probably it would be easy for you to go get the resources that would be required to bring about successful change, right. And you also negotiate advantageous agreements, and with them you negotiate, so that you get better support through this negotiation, especially for any kind of change that you want to bring, right. So, you need to collaborate with those stakeholders and also negotiate with the stakeholders, so that you become in an advantageous position, so that any change agreement that any change that you want to bring, there is a agreement from these stakeholders, and that is how you can exercise and acquire power from various stakeholders. Moving further, since we are talking about stakeholders here, you need to identify who are your stakeholders, right, whether it is an individual or a group which is going to affect the outcome of a change. So, any individual or group who is likely to affect the outcome of a change is to be considered as stakeholders. Now, you also need to identify powerful stakeholders, because that is where you need to manage them effectively, because those stakeholders who are not very powerful, they would not oppose or bring any kind of resistance to change. It is the powerful stakeholders who go for opposing any kind of change, or they would also go for resisting any kind of change, right. Now, how you go about it? At the first place, when you are going to identify powerful stakeholders, so you need to identify those powerful stakeholders who become powerful stakeholders, who have access to or and control to resources, right. So, those powerful stakeholders who have access to and control over the resources would be considered as powerful stakeholders, right. So, if you are in a position in an organization where you have access and control to the resources, which is being valued by others, then you would be called a powerful stakeholders, right. Then what you need to do? You also need to identify those stakeholders who bring resources to the organization. Third, they are connected to the workflow of the organization and they cannot be replaced. Fourth, they have shown their power in the past. So, all these 4 type of people could be called a group of stakeholders who could be powerful and who can affect the change, right. For example, the finance manager. Since finance manager have access to money and they can they are in a position to allocate monetary resources to various groups and departments, including initiative for a change management. So, finance managers could be a powerful stakeholder in this case, right, or a person who is an expert in production, he could also be a powerful stakeholder, because if he is going to oppose, then it is going to affect the production norms, right, production quality, and you cannot replace them, right. And if such people use power, then definitely it is going to be detrimental to the organization, right. For example, unions, sometimes unions also show their power and block any attempt of change by the management. So, these people could be considered as powerful stakeholders, and if they are going to oppose any kind of change or they are engaging in such behaviors which is detrimental to the health of the organization, then you cannot bring any kind of change successfully, right. So, it is very important to look into the various stakeholders who could be considered as powerful in nature. Now, moving further, what we are going to discuss when we are saying that which stakeholders are important. So, we need to identify, right, and here we have 2 major theories, one is normative ethics based theories, right, and the other one is instrumental theories. So, based on these theories, we can find out who are the stakeholders, or you can say who are the powerful stakeholders, right. So, if you look at normative or ethics based theories, what they talk about, right, they say that we need to keep the interest of all the stakeholders. Okay. When you are going to plan and implement any change, as a standard practice, you need to keep in mind the interest of all the stakeholders. So, as per the normative and ethics based theory, all the stakeholders become equally important, right. So, here the gain is that yes, you are considering all the stakeholders and you want to engage them in the process, right, and you want to see that how they can be attracted to ensure that the performance goes up, right. Now, the second theory is instrumental theories. If you look at instrumental theories, it says that you need to attend to the interest of those stakeholders who can affect their interest. So, you need to identify those powerful stakeholders who are important, right. So, the change managers need to focus attention on only those stakeholders who are going to affect the outcome of the change. One example that I have taken here is Shell. It is a gas based company which produces petroleum products. What they have done basically, that they have tried to actually integrate commerce with good citizenship. As a result, what actually happens that they have been able to attract and see that everybody is going to participate in the process to ensure that the organization is able to grow and develop itself, right. So, now what we have done here, that we have talked about normative and instrumental theories, and then we have a life cycle approach to stakeholders management. Okay. See, this is based on a resource dependence theory, prospect theory and organizational life cycle approach. So, you know that the kind of pressure that an organization faces is going to be different at different stages of their life cycle. It means, at the introductory stage the kind of pressure that you have different, growth stage you have different kind of, maturity stage you have different kind of what you call the pressure, right. And these pressures are related to what? Change. So, the kind of pressures and threat that you feel or you experience at different stages of the life cycle of an organization is going to be different. So, what actually happens? The stakeholders at different stages are going to be different. So, you need to identify which stakeholder become more important at what stage, and then you need to satisfy the requirements, right. So, this theory suggests that which stakeholder would be important at what stage, depending upon the kind of stage an organization is, whether it is in the introduction stage or the growth stage or the maturity stage, right. Because the powerful stakeholders would differ at each of these stages. And then it talks about how the organization is going to deal with the various stakeholders at every stage. So, since your stakeholders are going to be different at each stage, you need to take care of these stakeholders at every stage, right. So, if you look at the resource dependence theory, it talks about what? It talks about the dependence of resources of an organization on the environment. So, any organization is going to be dependent for its resources to the environment if it really wants to grow and develop itself. So, they are going to pay more attention to what? To the resources, because they need resources to grow and develop. So, those are stakeholders who control resources like suppliers, right. So, they need to focus more on that, because it is critical for their survival. And in this case, the change managers would be interested to attend to these stakeholders, so that the supply of the raw material is not affected, right, because it is very important for the change of the change project success. And if this the change managers find that it is the finance manager who is going to allocate money, so they need to be looked into, you need to pay attention to the finance manager, right. So, the level of attention is going to be different depending upon who is your stakeholders, right. So, you need to adopt strategies that how we are going to manage different kind of stakeholders in the process. How we are going to manage stakeholders, especially when it comes to resources. So, these are the 4 methods that have been identified, like being proactive, accommodating, defending and ignoring. Proactive means you have already built up good relationship before you start supply with the suppliers, right. So, you have already addressed the stakeholders, so you get the resources. Accommodating means that is you have adopted a positive approach towards the stakeholder. Defending means that yes, you try to address the stakeholder only when it is required. For example, if it is finance manager and unless the money is required, you do not talk to the stakeholder or the finance manager, or you ignore or refuse to address this issue, but this is detrimental to the health. This kind of approach is not good. So, the best is either to become proactive and accommodate, so that you are able to get resources from the stakeholders. Another theory which is known as prospect theory, it talks about the gain and loss. Whether in the process of managing stakeholders, are you going to get something or you are going to lose something, right. So, if you have the context of gain, it means you will be risk averse and choose the option with certain outcome or a risky option, because you do not want to go for a risk. You think that engaging or dealing with this particular stakeholder involves certain risk, right, and you will be looking for risk and go for a more risky option. Why? Because you think that you are not going to lose in the process, right. So, if you have this ability to take risk, then you go for a risky option. Okay. I know that if you are able to succeed in this, this is going to bring positive outcome, right. So, the context of gain and context of loss both are important, right. So, you have to say that when you are going to address the concern of your stakeholders at different levels, right, then you have to see that whether you are going to be risk averse or not. If you are going to be risk averse, then you will persuade all stakeholders to provide the resources, right. And if you are not risk averse, then you will be attending to only those stakeholders who control and have access to the resources, and this is what the prospect theory suggests. Moving further, you can see that yes, if you are going to address the concern of only few stakeholders, then you go for a more risky option. So, it is, though it is always good in ideal terms to move to look at the concern of all the stakeholders, but it is not, it may not be a good option, because some of them may be powerful and some of them may not be. So, it is always good to look at only powerful stakeholders who really opposes, and if you are able to manage them, then even if you have gone for a risky option, it is always good for you, because in that case you would get better support from them for the change. So, there are two theories. What happens if the threat is present there? In the absence of threats to the organizational survival, you use a gain framework. It means you go for a risk averse strategy, but if you think that yes, threat is already there, then you go for a loss framework, right. So, you adopt a risk strategy which involves what? Addressing the concern of only those stakeholders who are more powerful, right. But you also try to defend any responsibility for the concern of other stakeholders. So, that could be an ideal situation, while on the one hand you try to address most powerful stakeholders in the process so that you can get support for change, but at the same time you also try to address concern of other stakeholders, or at least defend their concern, so that they are also not going to oppose you. So, these are the two theories related to this one. Now, if you look at this contribution to the organizational life cycle model, what does this suggest basically? It suggests that yes, organizations are dependent on the resources. You need to ensure that which stakeholder having more resource, and at what stage of life cycle which stakeholder is more important, who is going to provide resources, right, and what kind of strategy you are going to adopt, whether you adopt a loss framework or a gain framework, right. If you feel threatened, then you adopt a loss framework, if not, then you follow a gain framework, right, or you ignore if you find that these stakeholders are not going to affect you at all, right. And that is what the last sentence says, that if there is a flow of resources, then you go for a gain framework, you go for a risk averse strategy and address the concern of all the stakeholders. So far what we have been talking about, that how we are going to manage the stakeholders. It means that first of all you need to identify which stakeholder is important, adopt a life cycle approach, see that at which stage of life cycle the organization is and who is going to be a powerful stakeholder. So, there are two approaches, either you address the concern of all the stakeholders or you address the concern of only those stakeholders who are powerful, who are likely to oppose. So, if you are going to address only powerful stakeholders, some stakeholders, then you adopt approach which is a loss framework, right. Or if you are going to concern the address of all the managers, then you are basically follow a gain framework, that is a risk averse strategy, right. This is the theoretical framework that we have provided to explain this. Based on this, there is a theory that have been developed which is called stakeholder theory, right. So, what we have identified so far is related to stakeholders. It means that it is possible to identify which stakeholders are more important or less important at each stage of the life cycle, and then you need to adopt a strategy to deal with each stakeholders, and it will depend upon what? The importance of the stakeholders compared to other stakeholders. So, at different stage of life cycle, different stakeholders may be important, right. So, accordingly you need to deal with them, and then you can go for a gain framework or loss framework to address the risk related with the change. And accordingly, once you have been able to analyze the stakeholders, to identify the stakeholders, and then you can assess the power and influence that these people have and how are going to address it. So, the second part actually involves for developing a strategy for persuading influential stakeholders, so that they are able to support the change. Right. Now, when you are going to identify the power and commitment of the stakeholders, so first of all you need to identify the stakeholders, look at the power and influence of each stakeholders, and then assess a stakeholders attitude towards the present change. So, let us look at this framework, right. So, you look at the power and attitude, low power, high power, here you can see, and here it is showing positive attitude as well as negative attitude, right. So, if there is a positive attitude, low power, then weak support, strong support, and then if high power and negative attitude, it means that these people or these stakeholders would strongly oppose any kind of change. So, they becomes blocker, but if high power with positive attitude, then they become strong supporters of the change, and if there is a negative attitude, but they do not have power, then they would be difficult for them to make any kind of opposition. So, the opposition becomes very weak here, right. So, through this figure you can see that what is important is to ensure that powerful people develop positive attitude, so that you are able to get better support from them. So, they become the champions for the change. Moving further, when it comes to influencing stakeholders to support the change, what you need to do is, the first strategy is winning the support of those who oppose the change and have the power to influence. So, for that you need to bring a positive attitude and high power, right. Then increasing the influence of already supported stakeholders, same thing, right. So, here what you are doing, increasing the influence of already supporting stakeholders, so that they are going to support the change. Third one, reducing the influence of powerful blockers. So, what you do? The blockers, so that their opposition is weak, right. Then a coalition of supportive stakeholders. So, try to move everyone to this place, so that everybody keeps support, right. So, whether you are here or here or here, you need to be brought in here, means that the organization has to ensure that you develop positive attitude, and in that case what will happen? You will be prepared to work to support the change together, whether you are here or here or here, right. Next, fragmenting existing coalitions who are antagonistic towards the change. If everybody is here, then you fragment them, some people go there, some people go here, some people go here, so that you get isolated and you get less support. So, if you blockers have less support, then they would not be able to block any kind of change, right. Or you also bring new people in this category, so that this group become more powerful, bringing new sponsors, champions into play. So, if you are going to bring more people to this category, which includes positive attitude and high power, so you get more supporters than blockers. So, what will happen? In this case also you will find that it is easy for them to get support from them. So, that is how we are going to influence the stakeholders to support the change. So, in this lecture what we have discussed basically is that you need to identify the stakeholders at each stage of the change and how we are going to manage them, right. So, if you are able to identify stakeholders at each stage of the life cycle, then you also find out what kind of a strategy you need to have in order to deal with each stakeholders in the process, right. So, the kind of grid that we have suggested, it could be used as a useful tool to identify the power of the stakeholders at each stage, and how you are going to predispose them to ensure that they are going to support the change and less oppose the change. Okay. So, with this we are going to close this lecture. Thank you very much.